Hello, 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 everyone. Today we're talking about chapter 20. This is actually the last chapter that we're going to cover this semester in Intro to Visual Arts. Two of my favorite lectures. Today we're talking about modern art, and then the next lecture we're going to be talking about contemporary art, which are two distinct things. A lot of times people use the word modern and contemporary interchangeable. They're actually different. So modern art is typically what we refer to as in the modern era, or the first artists that really made work about modernity or the changing in technology and the landscape around them. So generally we say about 1880-ish, sort of like post-impressionism, up until World War II, right after World War II. So, and for the sake of our chapter, we're covering 1900 to 1945 as the modern era. And then contemporary art is art made by living artists. So generally you could think about, someone that's up in age today, could have been, a boomer, born in the late 40s, right? So that's the difference between modern art and contemporary art. We're going to talk about that today. Just want to give you guys a special shout out and say I really appreciate each and every one of you keeping up with all of these assignments. I can tell you I'm missing all of you extra hard right now. It's difficult to do this remotely, but I appreciate everybody keeping up with their part online. So, and also if you're looking for things to do as an activity, I thought this was pretty cool today. The Arts and Science Center shared ways to stay connected with their museum, and I had an exhibition there about a year ago with my shaped work. I'll post this link on Schoology. It would be really rad if you want to print out one of these artworks, print out one of my artworks that they turned into a coloring book page. So pretty cool, pretty fun. If you want to print that out, if you do share it on social media, be sure to tag me so I can see what you all come up with your cool creations and variations on my artwork. So without further ado, we'll turn to chapter 20, part 1. Today we're talking about a lot of isms, a lot of different new ways of thinking and new art movements. So this is kind of like making art, make it new was sort of the mantra of the day. And like I mentioned before, modernism is really art that is about modernity, art that reflects the changing in technology, the changing in the city, the way people make things, the way people live. So really you could see kind of like the advent of the Industrial Revolution as sort of kickstarting. So we can even see precursors to modern art in things like Goya's artwork that we looked at before, like the 3rd of May executions, work that is in a way social commentary. But really we start to think about things when there's a lot of advancements and inventions. So in this piece by Robert Delaunay, Robert Delaunay was a artist working in France. Him and his wife, Sonia Delaunay, did a lot of color experiments, and we can see an emphasis on abstraction in this image. So they were really interested in science and how color was perceived. They would do these really interesting discs of color and then spin them to create these effects, and they wanted to show how painting could kind of reflect those new advancements in science and technology. So if we look at this painting, this is called the Cardiff team. So Cardiff is a place, it's a location, and it's a rugby team. So this is a team that would have played rugby, and all of a sudden athletics are starting to be on the world stage. You just had the first modern Olympics at the turn of the century, and then you had in France, you had the Olympics in 1900. So 1896, first Olympics, 1900 Olympics in Paris, and you see the Eiffel Tower back here. If we look close, there's a lot of details. At first, this just looks like abstract. And remember when we talked about abstraction, abstraction doesn't just mean nothing, right? It means taking a section of reality and simplifying it like an abstract of a paper, like a summation, a summary, just including the necessary bits. And Delaunay here is making this look both very new and modern, but it's also sort of looking forward to the future and how there's a lot of things happening at once. So if we look close, like I said at first, this just looks like a bunch of colors and shapes, and it looks completely abstract. But once you start to dissect it and dig a little bit deeper, you notice some imagery developing. So first of all, the Eiffel Tower back here. You can see this. You notice this half circle here. That is a Ferris. Ferris wheel. Actually, it was the largest built for the 1900 Universal Exposition in Paris. It was 328 feet in height. So if you're scared of heights, this probably wouldn't have been the ride for you. But it was a modern marvel in engineering. So that's in this painting. Also, this box kite plane. Think about the Wright brothers. They had just in 1908 had been airborne for about a minute. In 1903, in 1908, he was able to fly for 90 minutes. So in 1913, flight is still relatively new. It's not opened up for everyone yet at that point, but it's seeing as like, wow, look at what now and the future holds for us. So we can't make art that looks like past art. We have to make something that reflects this new reality. And really that's modernity, and really that's modernism. And that starts a lot of the isms that we'll look at through this semester, like Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and so on and so forth. So this was a term that Delaney coined called simultaneism, which he was referring to the fact that if you just look around and scan your periphery, there is so much going on. There's an infinite number of states and ways of looking and thinking simultaneously existing at the same time. Like, what a time to be alive. This right here is a billboard as well, and here is the namesake for the title of the painting. This is the rugby team playing rugby here, so you see billboards. And actually, if you look at a photograph from Paris from 1913 and the cities, they are just full of billboards. The book mentions that a French advertising company bragged that it could post a billboard ad in 35,000 different cities in the space of just 5 days. That's staggering to think about. So we think about today as being sort of the modern age, the information age. This was the birth of the information age, 1913, over 100 years ago, right? So this leads us into Cubism, which you can see a reflection of Delaney's experiments and also Picasso's experiments to lead into Cubism. This is really interesting. We looked at this painting in chapter 1, early on, the very beginning of this semester. It is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which means the women of the street. So these are prostitutes. These are women in a brothel. What's interesting about this and how this reflects modernity is it's a way of kind of looking back to look forward. So this was made in 1907, but actually Picasso didn't widely exhibit it for another like 10 years. He had a small show about 3 years later in 1910, and artists all over the place came and flocked to see this painting, which was really the shock of the new. And if you look at the faces, there's Egyptian kind of representations, right? Like from the side, but the eye is facing us. Notice that, like from the side, but the eye is still looking out this way. There's Oceanic and pre-Columbian masks as well. There's this still life here, and there's just really interesting kind of space in looking at how Picasso treats a three-dimensional space, but in a really two-dimensional manner. This was sort of a shocking painting, really large, really huge, beautiful painting, really interesting, but a lot of people say this is one of the most important paintings of the 20th century, not just because of what it represents, but how many artists were inspired by this particular piece. It sort of like shattered the expectations of what art could be. And it really made Paris the center of the art world for a long time. So Cubism is based on, this is kind of pre-Cubism, and Cubism then gets developed by Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso after this painting. Like I mentioned before, a lot of modern artists at this time, the mantra of the day was make it new. Just try to be innovative. Try to be what's sort of known as avant-garde, the advanced guard, like doing things to push new breakthroughs, to push new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing, to connect to your audience in a new way. If the world is changing so rapidly, then the art world should try to catch up with that, essentially. So we can't make art that looks like the Renaissance or like classical art anymore. We've got to keep shattering them and breaking the mold again and again. At the center of this new spirit of change, innovation, was Pablo Picasso, and it was modern art that's happening in Europe, so mostly Paris and France, England. And later that came to the United States, which we'll see around World War II. So for Cubist artists, the work was primarily about form. So here is George Braque. Braque was one of the innovators of Cubism. He saw Picasso's painting of the women of the street, and this is his reflection of that. So his influence of sort of breaking things down to smaller planes and motifs like cubes, like little tiny cubes. So hence the name Cubism. And it's this kind of this weird split. It looks like a Paul Cézanne, but taken to the next level. So these houses become just like really fractals in a sense, almost like crystals growing, right? If you look at this, it's a combination of geometric and organic. This tree here, which is kind of like in the foreground, but it's also in the background, it's really distorting our expectations of art. If you think about art always reflecting the world the way that we see it. Artists can paint very well and make things look naturalistic and representational, but they can, just like Mannerist artists like at the end of the Renaissance, were wanting to take that artistic talent, but then turn it so it represents innovation, something new. So this is the houses at Les Estaques, and it is a brand new way of seeing, and it's Cubism, right? And this is Picasso's then kind of take on Braque's experiments. This is an early Picasso Cubist experiment, and you can see the landscape still influenced by Cézanne, but it's almost as if instead of just, kind of like Van Gogh's Starry Night and things kind of get broken apart and moving, but that's still one scene. We can almost imagine, and what Picasso and Braque were doing is like, we don't experience the world in this very static way, right? We don't see just one view constantly fixed like a photograph. We experience the world by moving through it. So something might be towards the front of us, we walk around it, and then we see the side of it. Or when we're having a conversation, we see the front of someone, they turn, they reach for a glass, and then we focus on something else. So Picasso, as an artist, is inviting the viewer to experience the painting as if it's a real life thing. It's living and breathing, and you can walk through it and experience it and shift through these different spaces and planes. So they experimented with this together for a while. They were really innovative and experimenting with this. Another thing that was influential to them was studies of movement and early photographs like Muybridge that would do these movement studies like we saw before, Nude Descending a Staircase. And then they moved into this, what they called the synthetic cubism realm, and this is collage. And so Picasso was really one of the first artists to really push collage as an art process and art medium, raising it from just sort of a craft level to more of a fine art. And so if we think about this as a painting, it's not even actually a painting. And it's about, a still life, essentially. But he's trying to bring that still life to life and see it from many different aspects. So if you think about something like a guitar, which this is in the center here, you start to think about music. So you have music, you have sheet notation that might conjure up a concert, a wine glass, like an evening, listening to music, a newspaper here. This is actual wallpaper. So all of these items are cut and pasted onto the actual canvas. And he drew back into it. This is some charcoal here. So we call it synthetic cubism because he was, in a way, inventing with fake things by taking, instead of like painting wood grain, he's taking an image that already exists as wood grain and gluing it into the surface of the image. The next art movement that was sort of shocking at this time was called Fauvism. Fauvism is based on the word fauve, which in French means wild beasts. They were labeled this as a derogatory term, and probably the most famous Fauvist is the artist Henri Matisse. Matisse is a big influence on my work. I really like how he flattens things into planes, really decorative art and colorful. Picasso and Matisse in the early 20th century got very, very competitive, and they kept trying to one-up one another. They were sort of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, right? If the Beatles made an album and put a bunch of people on the cover with colorful outfits, then Rolling Stones, if you think about Sgt. Pepper's, then Rolling Stones has their answer with Her Satan's Majesties, right? Like they're kind of riffing off one another. So Matisse and Picasso did that. One thing that Cubists were looking at exploring new ways of representing the world, but kind of with a lack of color. If you look back at Cubism, it's really neutral colors, subdued colors, sort of grayed out. We call these sort of like chromatic grays, not real colorful. So Matisse is doing a similar thing. He's breaking things into planes, not too dissimilar from Post-Impressionists, which Post-Impressionists would have still been popular. Museums would have been collecting them. This is around the time where Van Gogh is starting to become famous. He died earlier, before 1900, and then his brother died. The wife of his brother, so his sister-in-law, said she was going to make it her life's work to dedicate it to making Van Gogh a household name. Because at the time when he died, he was not. And within 10 years, by 1909, she had every museum in the world wanting a Van Gogh. So Matisse is responding to Van Gogh's work, but in a very new way. And this was shocking. So Post-Impressionism was popular, and you looked at artists like Monet, Van Gogh, Gauguin. Those were in galleries and museums. But with Matisse doing this new thing, it was more shocking because they say, how could you take something traditional, like a portrait, and then just willy-nilly just add color to it without really kind of typifying, with the exception of maybe the eyes and the lips. Everything else is just really imaginative and not representational. Flattened out the forms to the fact where, like, if you cover up the top part of this image, it's like, what is this? Is this an arm? Is this a chair? It's nondescript. Is this a hat? It becomes very, very abstract. So you can see earlier artists like Cezanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh in the work of Matisse, but he's taking it to the next level. So this is Fauvism. The next movement is Expressionism, which manifests itself in Germany. So there was an early group of artists in Dresden known as the Bridge, Die Brücke, that advocated for raw and very expressionistic work. They did a lot of woodcuts, which we looked at in the printmaking chapter, like Haeckel and Kirchner, Emil Nolde. These were artists around the time of World War I and World War II who were trying to make really raw, direct work by not doing like really fine line detail, but rough, and you could see the gouge marks and you could see the grain of the wood. They were really trying to explore that. The next group of artists that were also in this camp of German Expressionism, known as the Blue Rider or Der Blaureiter, which was formed in Munich in Germany around 1913. And it was a group of artists that worked together, showed art together. And two of the best known examples are Vasily Kandinsky, who was originally from Russia, who then moves to Germany, and also the artist Franz Marc. Kandinsky, there's a lot to unpack here. At this point, abstraction, pure abstraction, non-referential abstraction, was still brand new. People were not used to making work like this or looking at art like this. So Kandinsky is really a seminal figure in the acceptance and spread of abstraction. And here, I think you have to think about his background. So he was a Russian artist that emigrated to Germany, and he was really interested in music. A lot of his pieces are called things like composition. And also, he was influenced by Russian folk tales. So if we look at this at first, it looks like just nothing, right? Just pure abstraction. And then you notice color first and foremost. But then you start to notice it looks like perhaps there are some figures in here and some trees, part of the landscape, animals. And so these are actually based on like these kind of folk tale tradition that he grew up in Russia. And then if you think about music, nobody ever expects music to be representational, right? Like it might reference, if it's instrumental, if it's classical music, it might be referencing spring or a nocturne. It might be referencing twilight or a particular historical event. But you're not going to line for line understand each particular movement as a, you kind of take for granted that music can just take you to your own place. Kandinsky, and this is not trying to necessarily make an argument for abstraction, but this is what Kandinsky is trying to do with abstraction. If music is allowed to take us places that maybe the composer didn't intend us to, perhaps art can do the same thing. So instead of seeing a particular tree or a particular landscape, you can imagine this as whatever landscape or whatever scene that you want to. So there's a lot to see in there. He also talked about, he wrote a book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. He saw his work as not necessarily religious, but this very spiritual. And this is a quote, he said, the spiritual in art is a power which directly influences the soul. So this is speaking not necessarily to our mind or our heart, but our soul as we look at this image. So a lot of times people think about abstract art as being really difficult to understand. I think it's some of the most simple artwork to understand. It's like if you think it's beautiful, if you like the color, if you like the forms, boom, you get it, you understand it. This is an artist that was also part of the Blue Rider, known for his paintings, depictions, tons of paintings that he did about horses, about animals. And he made all of these. This was kind of his style. This was his thing. He made all these horses blue. This is where we get the nickname, the Blue Rider, the blue horses. And unfortunately, you know, it's interesting to see like how Matisse keeps up with modernity, or Kandinsky, or Picasso, how much Picasso's work changes from his Rose period to his Blue period to Cubism to modernism to abstraction. He really evolves as the art world evolves. Unfortunately, Franz Marc was killed in World War I, so he died very young, so we don't get to see what he would have done next, which is to me really sad because it's a great talent that was lost in World War I, and I would have loved to see what he did next, how he would interpret Cubism and then Dadaism and then all these next isms, right? So you can see how there is color and emotion becomes more important than necessarily the specificity of the scene that Franz Marc is trying to represent. It becomes more dreamlike, more poetic, and open for interpretation. The next art movement happens in Italy. This author, Marinetti, publishes Manifesto announcing the advent of futurism. Problem is, there were no futurist artists yet. He had to go recruit them. But it really was an attempt to define the new century. And then there was a huge emphasis that was placed on movement and fluidity in forms. This is a really funny painting. I like this. This captivates kind of like the interest in taking a dog for a walk. Like if you ever see me walking my dog Cola, this kind of looks like Cola. And it's really like not me taking her for a walk. It's her taking me for a walk, right? And just look at the frenetic legs, like just really moving along here. And movement, right, is a very difficult thing to represent in a static, two-dimensional art form. I love how Giacomo Balla here does this in a realistic manner, but also kind of stylized to see that kind of like leash, like whipping along. You can almost imagine the sound of the dog's paws scurrying on the sidewalk and the leash kind of ripping through the air and making a swooshing sound, and the feet, you know, as the woman who's walking the dog is futilely trying to keep up with this dog. So futurism was really interested in modernism, the advent of technology, and showing movement. This is one of the founders of futurism, Boccioni, an Italian artist, and you can see also the fluidity, the shape and the form. So trying to show the movement, not just a static figure. Think about how different this is from the Egyptian sculpture of Menkaure, who's standing very, very stiff. Or Michelangelo's David has very little movement, if at all. And then, but Bernini's David has a little bit more, right? He's like biting his lip. He's about to whip the stone out of his, what's the word I'm looking for? You throw a stone with a slingshot. So you could see that that interest in movement in sculpture was there, but it's difficult to represent, right? Bocciano's going a step further and showing the figure as if you could imagine like taking a high-speed photograph and slowing down the motion here, showing the fluidity, the movement and forms. So this is a bronze sculpture. This is at the MoMA in New York, about 4 foot tall, beautiful, shiny, polished bronze sculpture. Futurism. The next art movement is Dada. So after World War I, a lot of artists were much more cynical, right? They're the sort of the positive aspect of artists reflecting what's going on in a sense of like innovation and new and like, oh, the future is wide open. World War I was pretty nasty and gnarly, and a lot of people were dying. There was a lot of new like mustard gas. You know, there was a lot of things in terms of like trench warfare that was just really dragged out and just nasty. And a lot of these artists even were in, like Franz Marc was in World War One. So the artists that were consigned to fight had a different outlook, right? So Dadaism is this sort of like reaction to the bleak reality of the war, and even moving in through World War II, like the kind of the hopelessness of what the current status instills on people. I think sometimes artists make work during the greatest of times when things are just like really happening and there's just this sense of anything goes. But then also artists are very inspired when there's difficult times as well. Which for me, I think brings it home. If you think about the context of today, I'm really interested to see 6 months from now, a year from now, think about all the artwork that's being made right now during the coronavirus as people are in self-isolation and having to move their studios from big studios to maybe in their house, but thinking about like how these are difficult times and how to maybe art changes based on those difficult times. Dada artists were interested in that. They wanted to speak to the conditions of their times. So as a movement, it was mostly meant to be like nonsense, really. Dada, the word itself, there's conjecture on what it comes from. So they claimed that they just pointed at a word randomly as they were making a collage and it said Dada. They were like, brilliant, that's going to be our name. So it could be like, what someone calls their father, or it was also, child's first words like Dada. Or other claimed it was a reference to a hobby horse, like the Germany, that's what you would call this like rocking horse. And some others just said, it was just meant to be completely nonsense, just like Dada. And one of the biggest known practitioners of Dadaism is Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp, really important artist of the 20th century. He really broke the norm and was very influential. So he really influences how people think about art and think about creation. So what's in this image right here? This is a painting that Duchamp made, but essentially it's a ready-made. He took a postcard from the Louvre where you could see the Mona Lisa, right? And Duchamp is a French artist, so he's dealing with art that's from his immediate surroundings, and he's poking fun at it, right? He takes this reproduction, a cheap reproduction that you could buy at the museum for like 10 cents, and he puts a little goatee on her, puts this little like handlebar, very fancy French mustache on her. That's all he changes, right? And he writes at the bottom, which he said was nonsense, but a lot of people have come to interpret this L-H-O-O-Q. Well, if you say this in English, it sounds like look at what I've made, or look at her. She's looking at us, we're looking at her. Also, if you pronounce, and notice .L.H.O.O.Q, which makes you pronounce the letters individually. And when you say them in French, L-H-O-O-Q, L-H-O-O-Q, when you say those in French, it roughly translates as she's hot in the pants. Or as Duchamp would say, she's hot in the ass, which means she's horny. Wow. I hope you're not like watching this around your parents, I'm sorry, or like young children, but hey, Duchamp did it, not me. It's a pun. It's saying like, you guys are holding Da Vinci, Leonardo on this pedestal, the Mona Lisa, and saying, look at how serious this artwork is. But we can make funny artwork that makes you think, that really makes you look. And this is an act of creation. It's also an act of destruction, which we thought about before with the work of, remember Rauschenberg did the erased de Kooning. This is another one of Marcel Duchamp's works. It's called Fountain. It's a urinal, essentially. He went to a hardware store, bought a urinal, presented it at the Society of Artists, Society of Independent Artists. If you were a part of the society, instead of like the salon in France where the government had to pick jurors that picked the official work, here this Society of Artists said, let's do this cooperatively. Let's pick the work as artists. If you want to show your work, if you're in this group, anything you want to show and call art, we'll exhibit it. So Marcel Duchamp says, challenge accepted. And he takes a urinal, signs it, R. Mutt, kind of like a take on like poor art, and then delivers it, puts it on a pedestal, says, here's my submission. They say, thanks, but no thanks. This sucks. Plus, our mutt is not a member of the society, so we're going to dismiss it. But Marcel Duchamp says, I am our mutt. I'm an artist in the society. You have to accept it, and they do. And this is a photograph by the famous modernist photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who brought European modernism to the United States. And this becomes really a huge gesture. If we see this in a hardware store, it's not art. But now all of a sudden you put it on a pedestal, we have to think about it as art. It's a ready-made. It's something that Duchamp didn't do anything to, but is declaring it art. And Duchamp was a good painter. We saw his work, Nude Descending a Staircase, but he moved away from painting. He said painting was dumb, and he wanted to just make objects, and he, in a sense, didn't even make them. He bought them, like the shovel that he called In Advance of a Broken Arm. And then later starts to say, I don't even want to make art anymore. He starts to say his artwork is just playing chess. So if you think about like contemporary artists today, where the process or like post-studio is really a thing, where you don't have to like make objects, someone else could make it, or you could buy something, or like Maurizio Catalan taking the banana, right, and like duct taping it to the wall. Very Duchampian is what we call that. So this is really early Dadaism. Dadaism leads into, and you could, I took a class, my whole art history class just on Dadaism. There's a lot to look at there, a lot of interesting experiments, but Duchamp is the best known practitioner. But a lot of these artists kind of got bored with Dadaism, and it moves into Surrealism. André Breton was a French writer. He coined the term Surrealism as this sort of idea that there is in the future a possibility of two states, dream and reality, happening at the same time, even though they are a contradiction. We call that surrealism. So a contradiction between reality and dreamlike. And actually, we see the artwork that was manifested during this time period becomes really interesting between this split of like fantasy and reality. So it gets explored in surrealism. And surrealist artists were some of those same Dada artists. This is De Chirico, who is an Italian artist. This becomes a really poetic, simplified image. You see this girl playing this game where she's rolling a hoop. This kind of looks like the streets right now because nobody's walking down them because we're all staying home in self-isolation. But she's rolling this, she's playing this game, and then we see this figure, just a shadow, peeking around the corner. It's very curious and surreal-like. It's dream-like because we don't know, is this a positive scene? Is she going to encounter a friendly face, a familiar face, or is it a stranger that's going to nab her and threaten her, right? So it's a really interesting dichotomy between reality and dreamlike. Probably the biggest name, and you all know, this is exciting because I really like modern art because we're talking about household names. Art that's a little bit more familiar, right? Like names like Picasso, Matisse, Salvador Dali. And Salvador Dali was a really interesting figure, Spanish artist, moves to the United States, and his work was all about the surreal, like thinking about the subconscious, the unconscious, and kind of like Freudian interpretations of dreams. This particular piece you've probably seen before, The Persistence of Memory. A lot of his work has elements of sexuality in it, but it's also a reflection of the reality of the day, like politics of the day and war, and just sort of this kind of bleak looking into this like post-apocalyptic future almost, like if we bomb ourselves out of existence. So it's like this fish-like blob here in this primordial state that's evolving from like oyster to fish to human, right? It's got an eyelash, eyebrow, nose, a tongue sticking out, and this beautiful image of these clocks. Like, what the hell, Dali? My boy Dali, he's just getting really wacky with it, with these melted clocks. The story goes that he was hosting a party, and there was some cheese, brie. If you've ever had brie cheese, you know that it's somewhat soft or malleable, and as the party was wearing on, the cheese started to fold over the plate. And he told everyone to get the F out of his house, and he immediately went to the studio and said, I've got to paint that. But as a way, that's a connection between reality and this kind of like dreamlike state. So he decided to morph the clock with this melted brie cheese that was on his plate that he was serving to his guests. So really interesting. A lot of landscapes that are in surrealism as well. So this is interesting how the landscape is sort of like another element in the art piece. And really for me, I see it as an exploration of the mind, like psychological. Like, where is this place? Can I put myself in this space? Like with Romanticism, it was like the power of nature and the awe of nature. But here it's more like nondescript. Like when you have a dream and things seem to be formless. Some things maybe are black and white, some things are colors, some faces you can see, some you can't. And Salvador Dali and other surrealist artists were trying to explore that. The next part of this chapter is politics and paintings. One of the things that the book mentions that I'm not going to cover is Diego Rivera, which is a really impressive artist that did a lot with murals and the politics of the day, thinking about socialism and communism in Mexico in a positive way and also moving that to the United States. Pablo Picasso, though, as I mentioned before, his work is very influential in the 20th century and one of the greatest political paintings of all time. And some people say this is the most important painting of the 20th century and maybe of all time, is Guernica, which actually represents a real event. So, Picasso, where is he from? He's from Spain. He's from this region in Spain that was going under civil war with the rise of Franco and the rise of fascism. This is during World War II, and what happened was German Nazi bombers came to Franco's side to help him. Picasso was on the Republican, not Republican like United States kind of sense of politics, republic, but he was on the side, he was actually exiled in Paris, and his hometown of Guernica was bombed in 1937. So the Germans came over and bombed the city, basically decimated it with hundreds and hundreds of bombs, which later gets known as a blitzkrieg, right, in World War II. They did this on this small town and just really decimated it, turned it into rubble. And here, Picasso had to make a painting about it. He was really torn up, thinking about the politics, thinking about his hometown was destroyed in the aftermath of this bombing. So he wanted to do something that was very allegorical. In a way, this is very classical. We can look at paintings by, say, Rubens, and you can see an influence of Renaissance-style art, Baroque-style art, Raphael, and others who did compositions using this strong triangular. You see this here, going from this arm here and the baby to the candle, down to the foot here. But it's also very new and modern and abstract. It becomes very influential. And Picasso, he was exiled in Paris. At the time, he lent this painting when it was finished. It becomes very, very famous to raise awareness for what was going on in Spain. And he said, and this painting then get lent to the Modern Art Museum in New York, and he said he wanted to stay there until Franco and fascism dies, which actually doesn't happen until 1975, after Picasso himself had passed away. So this painting, for the majority of the 20th century, was in the United States, in New York, even though it's about Spain. So after Franco dies, later in the 80s, this gets moved to a special museum in Madrid. So it's back to Picasso's homeland. So this innovation of how to treat space, how to treat a political event, it's not historical, it's contemporary. And I mean, you see like there's this woman here, this young mother screaming out in agony, holding her dead baby. Here's a dead soldier being trampled by a horse. We see this candle reaching in. This is supposed to be the all-knowing eye of God here watching this. The bull, which Picasso uses a lot as a metaphor for Spain because of bullfights, but also he represents himself a lot as a minotaur in this sort of mythological half beast, half man. Really interesting depictions. This is when modernism comes to the United States. Picasso moves to the United States. Other artists during World War II emigrate from Germany. You know, they're trying to escape the Nazi influence. They come to the United States. So this makes New York City and we'll see this later in the next chapter as well, become a capital, become a sort of an art center of the art world. American artists during this time period become influenced by European modernism, European abstraction, even when they're exploring realistic imagery, like Georgia O'Keeffe. And this is one of America's greatest kind of homegrown artists, Georgia O'Keeffe, very influential feminist artist, moved from New York City, kind of got tired of the hustle and bustle, to the New Mexico landscape and painted from her Model T studio the landscape. And she's probably best known for pieces like this. Sorry, this image is a little pixelated. Jack in the Pulpit piece, close-ups, microcosm of kind of the world, seeing nature. But it's like taking modernism that's happening in Europe and making it uniquely American. What do people see when they see these flowers? Okay, I'm going to go there. A lot of people talk about this and say, oh, she was painting female genitalia. No, that's actually bullshit. That was a male critic at the time was basically mansplaining of the day, saying, oh yeah, female artist, I see what she's doing. She's a female artist, she's painting vaginas. That's her thing, right? And George O'Keeffe at the time completely disavowed it and said, I'm painting flowers. I'm painting the world close up as you would see in nature. This is a close up of a flower. And that's all that these men sort of wanted to see and really reductively simplify her work. So when you hear people talk about George O'Keeffe's work and they say, oh yeah, that's what she was trying to do. I get it. I dig it. That's what she was trying to do. She was trying to show femininity and female bullshit. No, that's mansplaining. That's not really what she was interested in. The last artist that we'll look at from this chapter is Edward Hopper, another great American artist. This is interesting because someone else took this painting from the quarantine and took out the figures to kind of showing the reality of today, like the closed stores and cafes. But this is really about isolation and the kind of like the sense of like, even though these figures are together, everybody kind of seems to be doing their own thing and not really associating with one another. So the simplicity of the design and the geometry of it is inspired by European modernism and abstraction. And even though it's realism, it's also abstraction and more decorative, just kind of like cutting and pasting the shapes and really looking at design more so than the scene. So, it shows also kind of the sense of a response to the Great Depression and how people are dealing with the financial hardships. So it's interesting how works like this can become a reflection of the reality that the artist is living in. But when we see them today, our reality or our perspective is going to change them. So for a long time, this is just kind of seen as like, oh, kind of this film noir, really classical kind of like 50s scene of like kind of Mad Men era, like this is how it was in New York City. But really this was meant to be like people kind of had it tough and kind of slowly kind of got the financial economy kind of slowly bloomed back into existence, which is sort of similar to what we're in now with we keep saying like, I wonder when things will get back to normal, but in a way this will be the new normal, right? Things won't go back to being the same as they were, but they'll be their own kind of reality, and it'll be interesting to see how artists respond to that as well. So remember, this is part one. Think about the artists that reflect each of these isms so that you can define, say, what Cubism means or what Surrealism means, and then some of the key practitioners from each of those. The next part two from chapter 20, will be contemporary art, one of my favorite topics to talk about. So signing off, peace out, stay safe, miss all y'all, hope you're doing well.